Welcome to today's podcast. Today we have Joris, who's a renowned expert in terms of entrepreneurship and intrapreneurship. He started his career in Motorola and has also spent a great deal of time in academia. So he has a combination of the two and brings together that academic side as well as the practitioner side in a large organization. And welcome to our podcast, Joris.
Hey, thank you for having me, James.
Entrepreneurship is an interesting skill area. It tends to bring together the attributes of creativity and innovation and risk and bringing ideas to life. And in larger organizations, this is also an issue because organizations are under the stress of having to evolve quickly and match competition. We're in a very quick-paced environment of change. And some thought has been given to the fact that entrepreneurship as a skill, as an attribute, isn't just applicable to startup companies, but is also applicable to larger organizations, so-called intrapreneurship. And when we think of larger organizations, we tend to think of much more a process-oriented approach in which there are goals and defined processes and perhaps bureaucracy and maybe even risk intolerance. And I'm wondering whether the skills of entrepreneurship can find a home there. How does entrepreneurship need to be adapted to a larger organization that may have issues around their approach to risk, organizational culture, motivation? What are you seeing out there in terms of adapting entrepreneurship to large organizations?
That's a great question, James. I think entrepreneurship, the skills you mentioned regarding entrepreneurship are really almost essential now today in everyday corporate life. Because what does a young executive want and need to do? He or she needs to sell his idea, his project, his vision within the company to colleagues, to higher ups. And I think some of the entrepreneurial skills, you mentioned risk-taking, innovation, creativity, these are all needed to push your idea through within the confines of the corporate environment. If we look at the definition of entrepreneurship, one definition is the pursuit of an opportunity without regard to resources currently controlled. And I think what we would find is that frequently we work in a department, in a company, and we don't have the resources, whether it be financial or people resources, and we have to go and network in other departments, and we have to talk to management. And these are the skills that typically an entrepreneur encounters every single day. He needs to go out and find resources that he does not have. He knows what he has, but he also realizes what he does not have. When I say he or she does not have, and he goes and pursues those resources.
Yours, bringing those resources together, particularly ones that may not be under the direct supervision of the entrepreneur. As you mentioned, that's an entrepreneurial skill. In a large organization, typically we see the hierarchy performs that function. The individual talks to their supervisor, who talks to their manager, who talks to the executive, who then talks to maybe some executive in another part of the organization. And we see this formalized communication channel taking place. And what you're alluding to is much more of a free range approach where the entrepreneur person within the large organization can move to where the resources are and have that direct channel, that direct communication. Does this not change the structure of the organization from this top-down hierarchical approach much more to a horizontal integrated approach? And I imagine that must cause quite a bit of strain on the organization to be able to have people take this free range approach. Is there any issues around that?
absolutely. It puts a great strain on the organization. I would even say, oh, I hear an echo. I would even say that it's more of a bottom-up approach rather than a horizontal approach. In that, I think that companies should be looking for entrepreneurs initially, through their human resource departments when they hire people, because companies, in order to grow, they need innovation. Most of the innovations that are taking place are incremental innovations, but in order to have radical innovations, you need these entrepreneurs who really want to change something or develop completely new products, new processes. And you're right. If you work in a kind of a old, stodgy company, pushing something new definitely puts strain. And real life always plays a big role in that. I think some of the personality traits that one has to have if they want to go into an entrepreneur role is that they need to have a little bit of risk taking capability. They need to believe in their idea. They need to be brave. They need to be driven. They need not to give up. These are kind of the characteristics of an entrepreneur. And I think they have to accept the fact that they could get beaten up within the company, but they look forward to potentially a big win. They have to be flexible. They have to have problem-solving skills. They have to have risk tolerance. They have to have a high level of self-confidence and face the fact that their idea may get shot down. It's true.
And yours, and in addition to their idea not being accepted, it may also fail. And in traditional organizations, people don't want to have a failure on their resume. They want to have one success after another. And this also implies quite a change in the organization where failure is seen as an opportunity to learn rather than a stain on somebody's resume. And that suggests that the leadership and the culture and the way people are compensated has to change, because no one wants at the end of their yearly review for the supervisor to say, oh, you tried this initiative, it failed, therefore you don't get your pay raise or your bonus. That suggests a whole different approach to the way people are evaluated.
You're absolutely right, James. If a company wants to be innovative, develop radical innovations, creative, they have to change, like you mentioned, Pete, the way they hire people, the culture, the processes, the controls. You need the support from management. You need to give employees autonomy, responsibility, incentives to be creative. Ideas could get shot down, but they get encouraged. Failing is okay. Resources need to be put into projects. Compensation. You're absolutely right. So I think the modern company. I mean, let's face it. I think there's a statistic that about something like almost 80 or 90% of the companies, Fortune 500 companies from like 1955, they no longer exist, right? Because they could not keep up. My former employee, Motorola, does not exist anymore. Okay, it was a big, wonderful company that could not develop ideas fast enough, and the bureaucracy was just too big to survive. So all the companies, which are the most, the highest worth companies in the world today, companies like Apple, Google, Amazon, right? I believe that these are very, very entrepreneurial type companies with the correct people, processes, and controls and culture that fosters creativity and innovation.
This also suggests a change in the leadership approach. In the past, we've seen very autocratic leadership approaches in companies where it's the big boss at the top that defines the vision and the mission of the organization, and the followers simply implement it. And what you're suggesting then is that followers that change is much more bottom up, as you alluded to earlier, and that leaders have to be more follower centric, more focused around creating the environment so that the follower can take risks and achieve success. They need these tools and motivation. So it sounds as if you're flipping that organizational chart around so that it's more, rather than the followers implementing direction, that the vision can come from the followers, and the leader's role is much more of a support, much more of a facilitator, much more around creating the environment.
Yeah, absolutely, James. And I would imagine that at companies such as Google, Amazon, this is actually the case. The leadership is very open to ideas, to innovation, sharing of ideas. Employees are encouraged to come up with new ideas, radical concepts. I think even at Google, there's something that they call the 20% rule, where each employee is allowed to work on a project, on something that their heart is into for about 20% of their work time. They get paid for it. And these are the companies that are the most valuable companies in the world now, and they will be the ones that will survive. I think it's quite rare. For example, we all know about the famous post, what's it, the 3M post note?
Right.
Right? Okay. One gentleman, kind of took it upon himself to invent this post note, and he was an entrepreneur. But I think but the big organization was not really conducive to it, and that's an exception to the rule. But I think companies now are changing, and I think another word for leadership, as a matter of fact, or something very similar to leadership, is entrepreneurship. In that they're very similar. Maybe entrepreneurship is a really big subset of leadership, because leaders have to show by example, work by example, and encourage ideas and innovation, and this has to run throughout the whole company.
Now, Joris, when you were mentioning this need to adapt and to learn, if we look at traditional metrics or performance-based metrics, which is really topical, and even back to the concepts of the balanced scorecard, we see that learning is a major component of the balanced scorecard, and we see that the ability to adapt can be a metric, but we can also wonder about what happens to the failures of the organization. We can use failures as a learning opportunity, as we mentioned earlier, but a real performance-based metric approach in which it's constantly measuring how we were last quarter, last year, and trying to always see an increment, that may not be perhaps the best approach, as we may take risks, we may try initiatives, which either A, may take a long time to be realized, or they may fail. So I'm wondering whether the metrics of the organization have to incorporate this flexibility, this learning, and have a much more longer time horizon.
Yeah, I don't have an answer to that, James. I thought about that, how to measure. The wonderful thing about being an entrepreneur within a company is that you can use the company's resources, right? They're not your own. If you're an entrepreneur, you pretty much use your own, and the risk is much, much, much higher. About the metrics, to be honest, I don't have an answer how to measure. The compensation package should encourage, entrepreneurship with a probably a combination of short-term and long-term goals that are aligned with the company's strategy, and that should encourage risk-taking. But I don't have any formulas for that.
Well, one approach I can imagine is to take a look at the risks that were assumed. Were they calculated risks? In other words, did we take the approach of eliminating or mitigating all possible risks and then proceeding? Or did we continue just to analyze, or did we just take a risk without eliminating obvious ones? For, we can look at a new initiative and figure out what will go wrong and try and either eliminate or mitigate, share the risks and try and reduce them as much as possible. That might be one approach to taking a look at the metrics for entrepreneurship is the level of risk that was assumed versus the level of risk that could have been mitigated or eliminated.
Yeah, that's a very good approach.
Now,
definitely, yeah.
Yours, as we get to the end of our podcast here, do you have any takeaways for our listeners?
From my experience, I think entrepreneurship works in large companies, but they also, using this entrepreneurship idea, it also works for non-government organizations. It works in government organizations. And I think when one wants to do something, develop a new idea or a process, I think the first thing he has to do is kind of keep it a little bit quiet and don't advertise it so much. Yeah, kind of sense the environment, see if you'll get support for it, see if you'll have people that will help you. Testing the waters, because obviously if you start presenting it in the very beginning, people will shoot it down most of the time. Yeah, it's a bad idea. It's never been done before. It's been done before. We tried it. It didn't work. I think you have to kind of test the waters. And once you get a little bit more confident and success, then you will get more followers or helpers. And this is the way that you get your idea going. I think that would be definitely one takeaway. So preparation. You need to prepare a lot. And I think sometimes you need to bend the rules a little bit also. Because companies have policies, and of course you have to adhere to them, and I'm completely 100% for, integrity and all that stuff. But, there's always ways that you can get resources and get support for your ideas that may not be so conventional. And I think the main thing is to get the support for your idea, because you cannot do it alone. Also, as an entrepreneur, you can't do it alone.
Yours, and when you were mentioning that in some organizations, they say that this isn't the way we do things, or there's a bunch of policies and procedures that prevent it. Typically, when I hear somebody say that, we don't do that this way, and I'm not talking about doing something unethically, but within the ethical bounds, somebody says that, we don't do that, or we tried it before and we don't do that. I would typically suggest to them that they should start looking over their shoulder, because there's going to be a disruptor come into the market sooner or later that is going to do it that way, or doesn't assume that just because we've tried it in the past, we won't try it in the future. So I want to thank you, Uras, for joining us today. Thank you very much.
Thank you, James. It's wonderful.
All right. That's the end of our podcast, and stay tuned as we have further podcasts in the future.